how many minutes per slide? 24 slides, 30 seconds a slide.
Yeah, it gives you 12 minutes, so you'd still be ahead of time.
Perfect. So
If you give it like 40,
I
45
have no idea how long this is going to take.
that's fine. You've got a timer there anyway, so even if it goes a bit over, it's fine because there's only 2 talks today.
Awesome. Sweet.
Good.
Should I use the mic or just...
If you'd like, I think it's a small enough room that it won't make too much of a difference.
I don't think I'll be the most rowdy crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can lean into the mic and really yell at them if you did.
What was that?
Did you cook peas as well?
The peas? I actually, if you'd like some.
That's illegal.
Oh, pea. I did name the room in my partner's flat where I was processing all the pea plants, the pea lab. Yeah. Yeah. The septometer broke about halfway through the season and deleted all my data, that device, so that was a real bummer. Yeah. And every other piece of equipment I use, more like soil moisture sensors. I ended up finding 4 data loggers that did work, so that was a relief so I managed to get some data, but yeah, it was a bit of a, you'll see in the presentation, it was a pretty chaotic experiment. Yeah.
Yeah, you can make all the plans.
Yeah, I don't think we really did make all the plans. It was very reactive. Yeah, we didn't have, so the research, or the company who was initially going to sponsor it sold their irrigation sector, and so they dropped out. And so then a bunch of research institutes kind of chipped in, but there were a lot of things that just weren't budgeted for. What was it? Just because they sold their whole irrigation business. And then there was a bit of bad blood between them and the business they sold it to. Yeah, so it was just one of those, but yeah, we made it. Yep. Awesome.
Right, afternoon everyone. Gussie's doing a master's in mechanical engineering and she's going to be talking about subsurface drip irrigation in Canterbury. Enjoy.
Awesome. Sweet. So, hi guys, I'm Gussie. As I have said, I'm a mechanical engineering master's student, and I've done a rather unusual mechanical engineering master's where I have been doing some research on subsurface drip irrigation. So, just a quick overview of what this is. Oh, I was going to bring some irrigation in. If anyone wants to see some, I've got some in the lab, so you can...
Could you unmute
The mic? Yep, sure. So... Yep. How's that?
It's still red, right? Is that red or hot?
No. Mic. Oh, yep, lectern. Sweet. Awesome. Yeah, so... Anyway, subsurface drip irrigation is when you run your irrigation water through a drip tape underground, and then it's got tiny little plastic emitters that release a set amount of water. So the irrigation I was using released 1 litre per hour per emitter. So that's really slow emittance rate. And you'd cover your field in them. So this picture you can see here is for pasture, not for arable crops like I was growing, but it kind of gives you an idea of the spread of water from the irrigation. So just a quick sort of overview of where subsurface drip came from. So humans have been using irrigation basically since we stopped being hunter-gatherers. There's very few places where you can grow large numbers of crops without it. But a few sort of technological advancements had to happen for irrigation to develop. So the big change was with the development of mechanical pumps, sort of towards the end of the 1800s. You could have mechanized irrigation, and then in the 1950s the centre pivot was developed, and that created massive land use change where people could suddenly do different types of farming in places where that previously hadn't been possible. And then drip irrigation sort of happened around the same time, but that was surface drip irrigation for things like fruit trees, which a simple version of that is just drilling some holes in a pipe, But for that to be sophisticated enough to be effective, it really came back to materials science, as everything always does with the development of plastics. And it wasn't till the late 1900s that subsurface drip irrigation sort of became the technology got good enough for it to be a viable commercial agricultural technology. So general benefits of subsurface drip are it's incredibly efficient. So you're looking at sort of 95% efficiency, as in 95% of the water you're putting in is making it to the plants. Unlike spray irrigators like we see all over Canterbury, you're not losing any water to wind, you're not losing water to evaporation. You can be really exact about where your water's going. It's incredibly low pressure, and you can run like your whole area at once, whereas with a pivot, you might have a pivot over your field which is rotating at a certain rate, and the time it takes you to get back around again to the same place, you might not actually be able to hold enough water in your soil profile over a summer. So subsurface drip doesn't have these problems. If it's taken care of, it can last about 20 years in the ground, and you put it quite deep so that you can do all of your agricultural operations on top of it. Can be used for fertigation, which is...
What sort of depth? I have to ask that.
My one was at 25 centimetres, which is about the shallowest you'd go to still be able to do any mechanical tillage. For pasture, I think you'd probably do it at 10 centimetres or 15. But then you do have issues with cows are really heavy, so it's a bit of a balancing act. But yeah, it's sort of something where you've only got one chance to put it in the ground, so and choose your configuration wisely. So you can use it for fertigation, which is where you put your fertilizer through your irrigation, and that I think is one of the really cool things in New Zealand, where currently a lot of farmers are putting their fertilizer on by helicopter drops, like a couple of times a year, and then if a big rain event comes up long just after that, you'll just lose a lot on the surface, and they've spent all this money on fertilizer and it's not going in the ground, and it's ending up in our waterways and causing a lot of downstream environmental effects. So the precision this technology allows is really exciting in that area. And yeah, as I said earlier, you can use it for like massive areas. It's super low pressure, and you can irrigate your whole field. You can have a lot of control over your blocks and your system design, and so it's this sort of high-tech, high-precision agriculture. So sort of the opposite to the low-till permaculture style of doing things. Some disadvantages of it is that you can't see it, it's underground, it's hard to maintain. If your drip tapes get holes in them or get eaten by animals, it can be really hard to figure out where the problem is and what's going on, and you will damage your soil by getting to it. So it's vulnerable to root intrusion from your crops and your weeds. It's vulnerable to pests. I read one paper from the United States where they'd had repeated problems from gophers throughout their trial was their main risk. It's, I guess you can't see it, so it's pretty hard to know exactly what's going on, so you require a lot of technology to see what your flow rates are, what your pressures are, make sure it's behaving as expected. It requires a lot of filtration. It's quite expensive, and yeah, you kind of get one chance at your setup for the next 20 years, so you really want to make sure you get it right and you know how it's going to behave in your soil. So these are all reasons why Kiwi farmers haven't been quick to uptake this technology. We also just have amazing agricultural resources here. We have a lot of water. We have it pretty good, and so it's more common in sort of drought-prone areas like the Middle East or the Dust Bowl areas of the United States. But I think with climate change, it'll be interesting to see what happens in this area. So currently Canterbury's got a lot of centre pivot irrigation. You can see, this is just a Google Earth screen grab I took, and you can see all the circles from the many centre pivots, and you can see Lake Ellesmere just at the top, which is, I believe, the most polluted lake in New Zealand, which is primarily as a result of the dairy industry. So the reason we have so much irrigation in Canterbury is that we have more evapotranspiration than rainfall in a year, especially over the summer period. And so to do a lot of agriculture down here that isn't like sheep farming, you do require water additions. So here's my trial I ran. So this was out in Lincoln on Springs Road near the university. It's quite big, as you can see, so I did a randomized or repeating block trial, and we compared 3 different lateral spacings of drip tape to a spray irrigation treatment. Yeah, and so I ended up doing a lot of the installation for this myself with a lot of help from some friends. So to get the drip tape in the ground, we borrowed a mole plough from Netafirm, which is specially designed for drip tape, and it just ploughs straight underground and releases the drip tape, and you end up with quite a small crack in the soil, and that was the only soil damage, which was very cool. And then we used a trencher to cut most of the trenches, and then because of how we ended up connecting all of the drip tapes to the manifolds, ended up unfortunately having to do a lot of digging. So you can see some cameos from some familiar faces from mechanical engineering here. There's Danyan and Paul Doherty. And then to connect the mains to the emitters, we basically had to manually widen each of those trenches by hand. So there were hundreds of meters of trenches, and remove the soil, and they were too small to get a spade into. And then you were crawling around on your hands and knees, connecting the emitters to the manifolds. So that was about 7 weeks of work getting that in, plus a big sort of spaghetti junction of pipe work, because when you have a randomized block trial, you end up with a lot of pipes in funny places. So here's a sort of quick overview of my system. So you've got filters, air releases, and then I had one controller that controlled all 4 different zones of 4 replicates of each treatment. Unfortunately, the controller we were given was faulty and did not work for the entire summer. And so there was a lot of stress trying to figure out how much water was going on the field, and I'd frequently go out there and manually open and close valves. Or just check my phone and it would tell me it was putting a lot of millimeters of water on the field that I was not expecting it to, and having to go out there and try and diagnose if that had happened. So the other thing that happened was that because of huge delays in getting the componentry we needed, the system was not installed until about 45 days after the peas were first planted, which was quite scary, but luckily, as you can see from this graph, it also rained the whole time, which is not good for irrigation research, but good for irrigation research where the irrigation isn't working. So here's my rough irrigation regime I used. So the idea is you've got inputs from rainfall, from irrigation. You'll lose a little bit of water at the bottom to deep percolation from gravity, and then you lose water from evapotranspiration, which is a combination of soil evaporation and transpiration from the plants releasing water through their stomata. And the regime I used was replacing 70% of the evapotranspiration from the water balance. And the idea behind this was that you could maintain a soil deficit, and then if it rained, you weren't at saturation, and so you wouldn't lose any water out the bottom to deep percolation. So I think the real insight for me from this trial about irrigation was that if you have a sophisticated system, you shouldn't lose any water at the bottom unless you intend to, like if you're getting issues with too much salt in your soil. So, because a lot of the environmental consequences of irrigation are from water getting, chemicals and nitrogen and stuff getting into the water table or running off the surface. And you can actually mitigate that. And so a lot of irrigation isn't just your system, but also how you manage it. But that does require a lot of information about what's going on. So here you can see from some soil moisture probes I had how I kept the water sort of below the field capacity and above the point where the plants were going to die. Ideally I would have probably run it a little bit closer to where the plants were going to die, but that's easier said than done when you are invested in your crop. And then I had to sort of figure out how to evaluate this system and what to say about it. So there's 2 ways of doing that. So you can look at the soil moisture, and then you can also grow a crop and see, and measure that. So I did both of them. So I grew a pea crop over the summer. I could have talked for the whole 20 minutes about soil, but basically it's a very complicated organic system that does not behave like all the nice materials we're used to dealing with in mechanical engineering. And there's a lot of different mechanisms for water to move about, and only a small proportion of the water in the soil is actually available to the plants because the rest are bound up in the soil matrix. So there's 2 types of sensors I used. So you've got capacitance and TDR sensors, which are reasonably cheap, and you can stick them in the field, attach them to a data logger, and they give you continuous data about what's happening. Fortunately, you do have to install them manually in a specific place, and they are not particularly accurate. Ideally, I'd put them in probably 4 months before the experiment started, so they can settle into the soil. Otherwise, you get preferential flow around the sensors that ruins all your data. Mine went in about 30 days after the peas were planted. And then the other sensor I used was a neutron density meter, which is a really cool piece of equipment. You've got a probe that sends out a cloud of neutrons, and then they bounce back off any hydrogen atoms in the water. And then you've got a detector in the probe, and it'll tell you. So it's the most accurate way to detect soil moisture. It is not continuous, however, it's discrete data. You have to manually carry it out to the field to a tube you've installed in the ground, and then lower the probe into the ground. It cannot get even the tiniest bit wet, which is ironic as a moisture sensor. And yeah, it weighs about 20 kilos, so I was lugging that around the field. And yeah, they're worth about 70 grand, and you need a special license to operate them because they're radioactive. Lincoln University kindly lent me those over the summer, so that's where I spent a lot of my time. So yeah, it took me about 4 hours to take measurements from my 12 plots in my field. So I spent a lot of time on my little folding chair out in the field, lowering it to different heights, waiting for the cloud of neutrons to go in and out again. And then I also had a huge mess of wires all over my field, a whole bunch of different soil moisture sensors. So here's a graph sort of comparing the surface moisture from my various sensors. I'm just going to speed run through the rest of this because we're a bit low on time. But yeah, here's some plots of just sort of seeing a different soil moisture behaviour over the season at different points, showing that variation. I also looked at the lateral flow, so I buried a bunch of TDR probes laterally from next to an emitter to a gap in between an emitter. And from this graph in the middle here, you can kind of see that what happened was that water wasn't moving very far at all. That's sort of the main conclusion of my research. But this wasn't reflected in how the crops grew, which means the roots were still making it that distance. So in terms of research outcomes, I guess that's showing that the wider spacings could still be quite profitable and save you a lot of money on drip tape installation, but they'll definitely need to repeat this trial at least 3 times to make any solid conclusions. I also made the mistake of taking on an agronomist and a plant physiologist as co-supervisors. So I ended up doing a lot of that. So I did a lot of sampling. We'd end up with about 40 of these paper bags of plants sampled from specific locations in each of the plots, which I would then divide and divide and see if you could evaluate different mechanisms causing differences in yield and plant growth. So that would take me about a week for each of my cuts to process all of those plants. So I spent a lot of time in the labs out at Lincoln doing that. And unfortunately, it seems like my sample sizes were a bit too small and we didn't get significant results. One thing I also looked at was if plants are experiencing water stress, you tend to get significant differences in the leaf areas, which meant I took a sub sample from each of my cuts and then took photos of all the leaf areas and then wrote a script to process them, which fortunately also didn't find significant differences. I also looked at the leaf area index of the plants, which is use this device called a septometer to look at the light above and below the canopy. That device then broke halfway through the summer and deleted all my data, so that didn't go anywhere. And then for the harvest, I'd put aside a bunch of protected areas, which were not to be touched during the season, so I could evaluate the final yield between treatments. We then couldn't get the machinery to go in that direction because of how the crops had grown, and so I ended up harvesting across areas I'd already sampled. So I took before and after drone footage and then used GIS to figure out how much area we'd actually sampled, and then ended up weighing out 107 kilos of dried peas on a 5 kilo maximum scale that evening. So that was the gist of my research. I ended up growing a commercially viable pea crop, which apparently is quite hard to do, which wasn't what I was trying to do, but I guess I could go become a pea farmer if mechanical engineering doesn't work out. And I installed a ton of stuff in the field which should be usable for 20 more years, and for this research institute to find out more about this equipment, and learned a ton of stuff. Thank you.
Got any questions?
Do you want to be a pay farmer?
Absolutely. I found my calling.
What did you do with the peas?
We still have about 95 kilos, so if you'd like some peas, there is a minimum order of 20 kilos.
So can they be used for seed?
Yep, you can grow them. I don't think I'm technically meant to because there's some IP protected strain, but they were beautiful plants. I would recommend growing them. You could also rehydrate them and use them as soups.
Yes, okay.
So I'm actively involved in spray irrigation and pasture. I'll be starting my hard hose gun again tomorrow for a 4-day run, so I'm quite familiar with the process of irrigating a small block frequently. Remind me again your impression of this as a tool for pasture, for stock, so just regular grass and clover mixes, and what's the cost benefit? I know it's early days, but what's your feeling on cost benefit?
I think it'll depend on it's been found to be beneficial, and I know there's a lot of research done in Australia on this for pasture, but it was comparing it to border check irrigation, which is about 60% efficient, whereas we use a lot of centre pivots and things, which are like 80 to 85% efficient, assuming you're running them when it's not windy, which is a big if in Canterbury. So I think it's probably going to depend on the price of water. That was something I really wanted to get into with this research, was an economic analysis, but unfortunately the trial just ended up taking a lot more man hours than I expected. I think the application of fertilizer is probably something that's going to be a big factor in the financial equation, because if you can actually make sure your fertilizer's getting to your pasture and not being lost out the bottom or lost out the top to surface runoff, that's going to be a big factor.
And you suggested that depth could be up to 250 millimetres or something like that.
Yeah, so that's where
So you can cultivate to a low depth
yeah,
without damage.
yeah,
Is
you
it
can
possible?
you can do it even deeper if you want. I guess it's just that balance between making sure it's in the plant root zone, but also I think what we've seen here is that the plant roots will grow towards the
Yeah. So that's
sphere
the
of
other
water
thing.
from the emitters.
I'm dug up many irrigations things and leaking valves, and
Yeah.
roots are just an absolute magnet for those small leakages. So I'd be concerned about that disadvantage you mentioned about blockage of the holes and that sort of thing.
I think if you they've got some quite fancy systems now. So the one I've got has a whole bunch of things where there's very few channels for roots to get in terms of how they've designed it. It's also pressure compensating at each emitter, which gives you a lot more control, and you can generally get a lot of feedback from the irrigation controller on the system. But I think it is the kind of thing where, because it's underground, you really do need to go that very high-tech, high-information density route and make sure you're doing your soil moisture sensing, which one interesting thing I learned is that all farmers who are irrigating now are required to have at least one soil moisture sensor and get audited and have to prove that they understand what it's telling them, so that essentially you're not over irrigating. But then a lot of farmers have actually realised that saves them a lot of money and have of their own accord gotten more, which is a really cool sort of niche where you can do something that's more environmentally friendly and it's profitable for people, which is always cool when that works out.
Any other questions?
Awesome.
Emily's doing a PhD in mechanical engineering right now, but presentation's not on your topic, but on something else. Quite interesting.
Thank you. So kia ora koutou. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Emily. I'm a PhD candidate in our department. I'm working with Stephanie in the Dynamics group, working on developing an insulin sensor. But as Pav said, I'm not talking about my research today. I'm going to be talking about a trip that Sydney in the back and I went on. Sydney is in the linguistics department. He's also a PhD candidate here at UC. So today I'll be talking about giving a brief kōrero discussion on our trip to Te Tai Tokerau, Northland, that we went over on Waitangi weekend with the New Zealand Chinese Association. So although my presentation isn't on my research, I hope you can gain something from it and find it thought-provoking, which is why I'd like to start with first posing a pātai, a question to you all. So what does it mean to be tangata tiriti? So for those of you who don't know, tangata whenua means people of the land, so the Māori, and tangata tiriti then means people of the treaty or non-Māori, so people who are here in New Zealand or here in Aotearoa because of the treaty. So it's a bit of a big question, but as a New Zealander or even just somebody living in New Zealand, I think it's an important question to consider, and so we'll be unpacking this a little bit today throughout the presentation, and I'll be coming back to it at the end. So I'll first give some background about our trip, and I'll introduce the story of the SS Ventnor. So early Chinese settlers in Aotearoa, New Zealand arrived from southern China in the 1860s, working in the goldfields in Otago. Coming to New Zealand provided them an opportunity for a better life. Many intended to work in New Zealand for a few years and then return home. However, some passed away in New Zealand before they could return and were buried here in Aotearoa. In the Chinese culture, it's important that you be buried in a place where your family can take care of your spirit. So work began to organise a voyage to repatriate those who had passed away in New Zealand back to their families in China. The first of these ventures was in 1883 and was successful. A further voyage, the SS Ventnor, set sail from Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington in 1902. Travelling up the west coast of the North Island, the Ventnor struck a rock off the coast of Taranaki and ultimately sank off the coast of the Hokianga. On that day, the lives of 13 men and the remains of 499 were lost. In the aftermath of the incident, local iwi, Te Raroa and Te Roroa found carefully packaged remains washing up on their shores. They cared for them as if they were their own, even burying the found remains in their own urupa or cemetery. On both the Māori and the Chinese sides, stories of the SS Ventnor were passed down through the generations. However, it wasn't until 2007, more than 100 years later, that key members of the New Zealand Chinese community had learnt of the manaakitanga, the care, the generosity and kindness that local iwi had expressed towards those lost in the incident, re-establishing the relationship between the Māori and the Chinese due to this connection. So now on to the trip itself. The trip was named Paruru, which means place of shelter. It's symbolic of the shelter that the people of Te Raroa and Te Roroa are provided and the connection that we have with the people and the iwi and the Hokianga. So the kaupapa, the purpose of our trip, was to strengthen our identity and connection to Aotearoa, New Zealand through a cultural journey. We had three key outcomes. The first focus was on heritage and whakapapa, or genealogy, celebrating our shared heritage as Chinese New Zealanders, and through deepening awareness of our whakapapa and the journeys that brought our ancestors here, we acknowledge them and the place that we call home. The second was focused on future relationships, connecting with tangata whenua as people who have, through time, provided a place of shelter for us. Reciprocating their respect shown and shown to us and our ancestors in Aotearoa as we connect with our own identities, strengthening these relationships for the future. The third was our current place. Our physical place and our place in time reflects on what has gone before us and what lies ahead. So understanding how Te Tiriti, the treaty and other founding documents have allowed us to build a life here and how we honour it in the future, which ties in nicely to our partai. So over Waitangi weekend, we made our way around Te Tai Tokerau Northland, with the final day being spent at Waitangi for Waitangi Day. There were about 50 of us on this trip, on this journey together. So the focus for the first part of our haidanga or journey was honouring the relationship between the Māori and the Chinese, forged due to the sinking of the SS Whenua. So during this time, we paid our respects to our ancestors and the New Zealand Chinese who came before us, who paved the way for us to be here in Aotearoa, learning and reflecting on our history in Te Tai Tokerau, Northland, and thanking the iwi of Te Rarawa and Te Rorua for their manakitanga. The organisers packed a lot into the 4 days of our trip, but I'll just give a brief summary of some of the things that we got up to. So we practiced Bai Zai or Bai Jai, making offerings to our forefathers at a number of significant sites. So this is a spiritual ritual or custom in which we pay our respects to our ancestors and those who came before us. Respects are paid in a number of ways, including the burning of incense as shown here, and the sharing of food to feed the spirits. We attended a ceremony in Mania, signifying the return of the Po Whenua, Paruru. It's a symbol of the connection between our communities and was gifted to the New Zealand Chinese by local leaders in the Hokianga at the unveiling of the public SS Whenua Memorial there in 2021. The Po Whenua also inspired the name for the trip. We also heard stories from those in Mitimiti and visited their urupa or cemetery where the Spirit Gate Memorial is located, and some of our Chinese ancestors are buried here. So as a rōpū or group of young Chinese New Zealanders, we can now continue these connections onto the next generation and share our stories and experiences. So looking back at our past provided us the foundation to look towards our future. During the second part of our journey, we travelled to Waitangi and attended Waitangi Day commemorations. So representing the New Zealand Chinese community, this was an opportunity for us to build new relationships with the people of Mapui. We were invited to Te Tii Marae at Waitangi and were formally welcomed onto the marae with a pōwhiri, a welcome ceremony. Not only was this a pretty surreal experience, but it was also very significant for the whakawhanaungatanga, the establishing of relationships for our community, as unlike the places we'd previously visited, we did not have existing relationships here. We also shared in meaningful and topical wānanga or discussion forum on our partai. So what does it mean to be what does it mean to be tangatiriti? To me, it means being willing to learn and seeking out opportunities to learn and embrace the culture and perspectives of tangata whenua, and to this responsibility to honour our history. This experience was key in my journey to learning about and understanding tikanga Māori protocols and procedures, and also te ao Māori culture, which my knowledge of previously was quite limited. It was my first time being involved in pōwhiri and also staying on a marae. So being immersed in a Māori world on the marae for 3 days or 3 or 4 days opened up new perspectives. Having knowledge of te ao Māori and te reo Māori as well provides a platform to build relationships, and issues such as those with law and policy making could be resolved by leaders and future leaders having understanding of this culture so as not to work against its people. By educating the young people, us, we allow the next generation a better opportunity to correct previous wrongdoings and to understand as well why they were wrong. So I don't want to go too into depth about talking about my cultural identity, but having this understanding of Māori culture has helped me develop a better understanding of my place here, not just as a Chinese living in Aotearoa, but where I fit into Aotearoa as a Chinese New Zealander. So from the Chinese side, there's this concept amongst the Chinese of overseas Chinese. It's a way to describe people like myself, those of Chinese ethnicity who haven't settled outside, or who have settled outside of China or reside outside China. It sort of, in a way, implies that we're not real Chinese per se. I mean, I don't speak the language, so who am I to say what it means to be Chinese? And then from the New Zealand side, as I've said, the Chinese have been in New Zealand since the 1860s, and we have quite a long history here. But there's always this feeling of being an outsider because we look different. And people still comment to me that my English is so good and ask, where am I really from? To which they're usually a bit disappointed by my answer. But so from both sides, from the Chinese side and the New Zealand side, I sort of feel this need to reconcile with my identity. So I've previously solely focused on developing the Chinese side of my identity, as this is my heritage and my ancestry. But developing my knowledge of Māori culture has kind of added another puzzle piece to my image of identity, I think. So I hope that you have enjoyed learning about my experience on the Paruru trip. I encourage you to learn more about Te Ao Māori, and it's been my first step in helping answer the pātai that I've posed today. Cool. Thank you.
Have you got any questions?
Yeah. No, thank you. And it's a really, I think it's a, yeah, it was such a inspiring trip and you sharing your like reflections and yeah, I guess I also want to ask an alternative question is, what does it mean to be a Chinese New Zealander? Yeah. Well, what do you
Yeah, it's quite a unique identity, I think. What does it mean to be a Chinese New Zealander? It is a big question. Yeah, definitely something that I've been thinking about a lot. But I think it means, to me, honouring our history and what's brought us here. I'm not sure if many people know about the sort of hardships and the sacrifices that a lot of the early Chinese made to be here in Aotearoa, and things like the poll tax and you know, something that comes with building a life where you don't know anyone and the culture is different and everything. So I think it's just honouring that history, I think, is what it means to me.
Thank you. I mean, really interesting and inspiring. And also just to add to that, please continue to tell the story and to tell what it means to you, or ask others what it means to them to be a Chinese New Zealander or an other New Zealander, which I am too. And are there more opportunities for groups like this, or for future students or future young people to join this group? How would people find out about that?
Yeah, so our trip was organised by a group within the New Zealand Chinese Association, just because of the connection with this history. And I'm not sure if they're intending to do future trips, but we're looking at sort of doing things similar to this, which ties in quite nicely to what Sydney and I are kind of helping organise, is potentially sort of bringing this idea of learning about the local history to Canterbury, and so there's history in Ashburton with the Nanking Chinese market garden settlement there, and it's a heritage New Zealand site that was recently opened only a couple of months ago actually. And so we're thinking of bringing that kind of idea of learning about local history down to Canterbury with this idea of going to Ashburton and kind of extending this idea.
And just continuing with it. And last question there. It's great that so many people have come to hear you today. Will this be shared more widely in the department or in the university? Because I think a lot of people could learn from your experience and your explanation of what it's like to be a Chinese museum. Would this be published anywhere else around the university?
I mean, we could potentially.
Put it somewhere on the website or the MEC
True.
publicity magazine or something like that. It's really nice, especially for people like me, to have stories that aren't just about your research, but to show that not everyone's research in particular, but that there's more to being a student than your research.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think I wanted to give this presentation today as kind of a way to gauge the interest in this kind of area, because I really wasn't sure if many people would be interested hearing about this. So yeah, but that's really cool if you think that would be worthwhile.
Absolutely, I would love to be for more students to understand other students outside of whatever it is you do.
For sure. Gussie.
What do you put in the census? Because I don't remember there being a category for that group of New Zealanders.
Yeah, I think I can't actually remember. I think it's just Chinese, but like, yeah.
Would you prefer there to be like an acknowledgement of the specific group who've been in New Zealand a lot longer than many of the early European settlers?
It's interesting because there's a lot of different waves of migration from China. So I guess the term Chinese just kind of encompasses everyone being the old and the new settlers. So yeah, I'm not sure if that distinction between the two would be I don't know.
Helpful.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a good question.
Any other questions? Do you have any questions for either of the speakers? I think they'll hang around for a little bit after this. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer it.
Also, all good. I just wanted to draw attention to a journal article because I mean, a lot of us read a lot of literature, but yeah, there's this article that Lincoln, a teaching fellow at the University of Auckland, posted or wrote. It's called Being or Becoming an Asian Tangatititi. So, in case that's of any interest to anybody. Yeah. Good. How do I turn this off?
Oh no, they're not at all. I think it's just
Last weekend I went out to on and off beat. People laughing at me. Totally fashion, please. Yeah, I normally bike around out to the north, around the south part of like that. Yeah. I think the only time bike to north side is what's that park called? I used to have a motorbike, so I think my motorbike. I don't want to get an ass down the other side of the face.
Yeah, I tried around like the easy adventure park trails. Really bumpy stuff. Yeah, bailing out halfway down the gravel road and just riding out.
I saw quite a few like real cyclists.
Oh yeah.
I think like some go to the park, take the whole ride up, they should
That's where I'm find an easy way down.
Now I'm going to go quite next. Have you biked too much? After that, you can take me up to the road.
Yeah. It's supposed to be a nice trail that goes all the way from like the sea to the I think it's like nice part of the trail. Not sure what it's like. I'll check that out.
Doing the hanging power.
Oh yeah.
Have you done it before? I did it last week, so my pace was 6, which is 30 minutes.
Yeah, I think 20 minutes after is like a good benchmark.
Yeah, I don't go too fast. I go below average.
Just jogging. Is it like the north highway loop?
It was a wide ride around this, so it's just better. Also, I guess we did use that.
I like running, so I say
I'm pretty good at biking, so yeah, should be good at it.
I might try that.
If we're gonna have university things, you could way more money. No, they come to junior, have a fine, they'll be something to do. After they extend you. I'm on until next year, so and then not change it, it's pretty much do I do all that?
Hear what you thought about this stuff.
Jump in and do what I want. Possibly, yeah. I don't know I'm doing it yet. Chris does.
On the grass, that's where you really
soon. I'll see you later.
People will water in the evening to avoid evaporation, because then it's going to take some. So it does sound just so.
Understanding what went on. Yeah, and then 2021 there was public water tables. And then so like a large group of elders, I guess, went and there's a number of buildings, public one, and then there's also the spirit area, which is an area, and it's different vibes.
Which isn't necessarily issues of decision to our farmers and
I mean, I knew I was like, it's January now, don't worry, go here. And then maybe February onwards I started looking. And then it was originally going to be the end of April.
The previous
So
trip
basically,
was
they should have
more
lost the case on this.
so this was a way to bridge the stories.
And then they confirmed, we got the receipt confirmation
on
of
this
the
trip
receipt
were
it. So I was like, we'll push it back.
um,
And one of the reviews is already
Yeah,
issued.
basically, yeah. So I think
This
we're
year's
hoping to do this more.
humans that come here.
I'm not sure.
Half of the whole
I don't know what it was
do they
research
do?
and cool and
I think it's
Proper burial rights and everything. In lieu of the actual people who would be able to.
Yes.
The bodies never get repatriated a second time.
Even just,
I don't
looking
think
at,
so.
I'm
I think there's a lot that will still cost.
actually where around the world and it's
Yeah.
Very few that actually made it.
Yeah.
One further out or figure it out.
Yeah, so I think
the
You gotta,
the ones that are now.
Big one, yeah. I just dreamt functioning like
From
from column C to column CWD.
oh,
I know.
That's a lot of building
It was like
This is, because the idea of giving them home
of being big
needs to be aligned with.
Yeah, and a way for them to
clear lands. And I actually
So this is partially that, that's taking care of the.
Yeah, yeah.
It's quite hard one.
There's,
effect on that.
I mean, of the
Land
ones
clearing
that
curve
did,
looks like this, so I have to
get
calculate
reburied
if
here.
the values of time
I think
is
there's
this,
only a few ones.
it's this equation,
Yeah,
I worked on Google Sheets and some course.
oh, I know, it's devastating.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
I know.
It's just a train
I always wonder why they keep sitting with that.
And like,
Yeah.
also
I keep sitting backwards.
That's not.
No, I want it is normal people.
Yeah, I was like, that's gonna do for me.
I do think that
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So like first generation versus the other.
They don't need to sign into
Yeah.
which I guess is good if
Good
the
kind of
whole thing. Literally just decided where it's like literally only get them if you don't get part of the research.
Maybe do whatever the hell you want.
I'd be like, oh, great.
If I can come up with a talk. Yeah.
don't mind.
Like if everyone kind of knew that this is sort of like,
Yes,
so I believe it was where it was saying that it doesn't have as many functionalities as the look like it could which is like
Yeah, I got like just over a year long.
This is probably a good time to do a presentation.
Yeah.
A recap, maybe like your coming back to the office.
your
Yeah,
work.
yeah.
You know, but this is really important.
You
And
still,
I think
you're already open to
especially
coming back to the office.
educate
And we're doing it for you.
the students,
No, I
not
just think
the
it's hard to
students that were in this
practice.
group too,
Because
about
I was
your
reading books
experience
as well.
of Chinese New Zealanders.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a really high
Cool.
quality presentation.
It's later.
And what a cool experience to get to go to Waitangi and Waitangi.
Yeah, it was.
You got invited to TTA to ride.
Yeah, it was.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
So what was your personal family history? Sorry.
How are you?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm
How's
no,
that?
I actually connected to the Vietnamese story myself.
Are you?
But we met as like a wider group in our community to kind of bridge the gap between
I
our
thought so,
stories
but
between
yeah.
the previous generation
But
and
you're sort
ours.
of there.
I was just thinking had before, like previous groups who had gone were generally like the elders of our community, and so yeah, kind of
Yeah.
teaching our generation about this history. And we
Within
had
our
a number of
community,
young people in our
What
group
relief.
who were
Yes, that took care of that. And that's
direct
fees
descendants
and
of some of the
assignment,
people
which
who
is
were on the
which
Vietnam.
covers
So great.
yeah, a lot of
So you're
the
just gonna go home home.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Was this a group you've been involved in?
I'll go with you, you know that.
In terms of
But I
the
got a couple
Chinese
months extension,
Association in New
so
Zealand? Was that like
back early July.
something
Right.
you,
I'll have a great time.
Yeah, yeah.
is that your community?
It's all right.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
all
So
right.
I
The data
grew up in
processing, that's the
Wellington,
big
and so I'm not
Yeah.
as connected to the
But it's on well, you've got all the stuff you need.
Yeah, I think
Time.
data-wise,
but
it's
while
what
I think
processing
over the
wise,
past
it
couple of
depends
years
on
I've been trying to get more
the data that
involved.
I collected quite a
So
lot.
we gave
So
a
I
similar
perhaps even
presentation
overcollected that.
about
In
three
terms of
of
how
us
much I can actually
a
present
couple
for the
weeks ago
thesis
on
versus
this.
how much will need to be
And
processed after the thesis.
yeah,
It's just sort of
kind of trying to get
deciding
more
what
involved
line I can
in
draw
that
where this is
community.
good enough for
But
the thesis
the
versus
group that went,
I
it
need a
was
little bit more, or if I
yeah,
do
she said it
more,
was
it
like
would be
people
more of a
all
sure
over
thing,
the
but I
country.
don't.
So it's been so
Well, it helps
yeah,
time to just
exactly.
think
And
about
so
that instead
yeah,
of
having these
making
really
forced
interesting discussions
decisions.
about
For sure, that would be quite good. I'm looking forward to it.
Go home and just like eat.
yeah,
Otherwise, yeah.
everyone's
Either way.
experience on it.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Definitely looking forward to that.
So have a great trip. I don't
Yeah,
know.
isn't it?
Wait, what did you say you guys?
I'm 13th of flying out, so next week's Monday.
Okay, that's have a
So
great
I've got,
trip.
I've got next week's still out there.
Like this is weird thing where it's
I
like,
think you're doing this, it's really
Yeah.
interesting.
No, I mean,
I mean,
so
they
just
take
some
citizenship
experience
as one
that you
box
can
and then like
make.
this is
Yeah.
another box.
yeah, and I guess also because it's like, I guess I just look like a white Kiwi.
That book is what I was reminded of. Can't wait for you to do it. Have you read it? Is that the story of one of the
Oh, Troy Sivan. Yeah.
Troy Sivan.
Yeah.
It was like
He's the guy.
the guy
The
that
guy.
comes to New
Yeah,
Zealand
yeah.
Chinese like
Yeah.
relations and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that one?
It's a book called Merchant Minor Mandarin: The Life and Times of the Remarkable Choi Sivan.
Oh, I've heard of, yeah.
Yeah, it
So
was
this is Chinese Association like connected with
1989 businessman who set
No,
foot
so
here
it's completely independent.
was one of
1989.
yeah, was
We
one of the
have a
kind of
number
like
of different branches
founding
in the
fathers of
country,
the Chinese
but we
community into
also
England.
live by like
Okay.
national
I've got the book on my shelf, but my
but it's
guilty
not all
admission is I
people.
haven't read it yet.
Yeah.
But now after this talk, it's like I should read it.
And you know what, I've been getting in touch
but-
with learning more about,
Yeah. It's a.
Tangata Whenua
I'm not
and
sure
Ao
when
Māori
it
and
was
Te
kind
Reo
of
Māori.
founded, but yeah, it
It
was kind of
demands that you go and
started by
understand your own
early
heritage.
settlers
I did the whole,
as a way
to Ao Māori, the workforce
Yeah.
course here, which was
Support
like
each
a
other.
month-long
Yeah.
integral thing. And
But
yeah, I realized that how important it is to know where
a lot of
you
people,
come from.
especially
before
people
you
of my
can
generation,
embrace
have grown up kind of
being a
within
part
the
of,
association and still
Tangata
like
City.
sports
Yeah.
and
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I hope more people
but
are inspired to do that
Yeah.
from Emily's talk.
Yes.
What island are you from?
Glory.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh,
The hill.
no?
My younger brother lived in Karori for a year, or 1 or 2 years, yeah, while he was fighting up there.
And where are you from?
I was born in Dunedin, but I've grown up most of my life in Christchurch.
I thought you were Christchurch.
Yeah. And my parents are from Hong Kong and Beijing.
Mhm. I have to go to notes. It was so nice to have our offer, learn something new. Thank you. And good luck to you. Have a good travel. Yes. Travel safe. And see you when you come back.
Next Monday.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah, just for a couple of months.
Cool. I'll be back.
Oh, yeah, Merchant
Not sure we're
Minor
not gone, or
Mandarin.
I'll be doing, I might be doing some tutoring.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
I'm sure.
Both the jobs
Yeah,
have said that
that'll,
will start in
that'll open it up.
spring.
That'll, you can borrow
Yeah.
a copy.
So to finish that, so
Oh,
I
you-
didn't know if you
Yeah.
offered a job or were you?
I think
Because I was on my
both
yeah,
jobs.
special for whatever reason I was
No
like,
way.
yeah, might as well.
Nice.
Because I had watched like one of the interviews
All
from
my
the
experiences
ancestors
about
of
jobs
all
which was one of the descendant families, they had like a whole bunch of families that go up as well. So they had to go into the one about job security and IT system and it didn't work and they both reassured me that
Right, so you're going to learn something, just like you learned something about
realized the person you're talking about was Sydney, because I met him before. He's doing something in data science as well, or he used to work at Stats and Zed. So him and one of my close friends were used to be co-workers in Stats, or at least worked adjacently in Stats and Zed. And he came here to do, my friend did a master's in data science. I think he also was doing some kind of postgrad work in there as
So
well.
I think it's like computational linguistics or something.
And then he ended up, I think he left Stats altogether, so now he's just doing the PhD. He seems quite cool. Met him a few times.
He's on the new UCME campaign.
I
So I've seen his ad like a couple times, it's quite funny.
Every time I go outside, I see his face.
area you really
It just does seem like you sort of
Yeah.
get a bit.
So is that just, is both of you members of the New Chinese Association? What sort of, is it mainly like New Zealand Chinese who've been here a few generations, or what's the?
Yeah, so that was kind of how the association was started.
Okay.
But yeah, there's this kind of
I actually did.
it is inclusive of those who are say newer immigrants, but yeah, it was kind of started by the early
It's still majority.
kind of that whole idea of maintaining the community and
Sure.
providing that place of support.
My daughter is,
Have you been, are you part of the?
sustainability
I think I've
lead
been asked once by Emily
for
to join.
something to build
But it's just like
at Oracle and Christchurch.
See, as long as I'm part of the
Right now,
Future
she's
Association,
she's going over
which
to
is
Europe,
more specific.
management sabbatical. Don't know if
But I don't speak a word of like Future users.
But she's heading over to Europe just to
So, I
time
don't know.
off and looking at,
It's
she's
weird.
actually an architect, not an engineer.
I've got like
But her
basic
idea is
conversational Cantonese and Mandarin. I guess less reason to use it outside of family.
Okay, she's actually really enjoying the job that she's doing right now. She was at
Well,
Oricom.
In high school, did you get much talk about like Chinese immigration and
During
stuff?
computational.
in social studies? Because maybe it's a weird experience for me, because I had a social studies teacher in
And then she
Beijing
got an
who was
architect
Chinese,
for,
who
Guatemala.
like really old, Mr.
And then
Mr. Jin,
that was great.
who was like
So she went
probably
back
like 70-ish when he was teaching us already, and he had been raised in Otago or like in the no Goa. Yeah, like only Chinese kid there, and he's I knew like everything he said. There's like this unreliable narrative thing, because he's like, oh, I was raised by nuns, and he said like he never understood English until one day we all clicked, and he's like, oh, I can speak English now. I was like, okay, Mr. Jin. It was just strange, but part of our social studies was a lot of talk about migration, immigration, and obviously I guess being the Chinese man who had immigrated like what would have been like the 40s or 50s, I guess. There was a lot of like talk about Chinese communities in Southland as well.
Was a lot of that gold mining or what?
Yeah, primarily. First it was gold mining, and then as part of that a lot of jobs like grocery shops, like greengrocers, gardeners, laundromats, or not laundromats back then, just like laundry washing were done by Chinese people. And that's where the narrative of they're taking our jobs started. And it's like, they're taking the jobs you wanted to do, working 12 hours a day, like, like, you know, yeah, like, working crazy early and late hours to do the, you want this job now?
A great location for Christchurch, you know.
There's another book, because my dad is an art teacher and did a lot of Chinese literature stuff. So a lot of my books on my shelf are things like Chinese New Zealand relations and stuff. There was one called Aliens at My Table. About like the sort of view of like the other views of towards like the negative views of Chinese people in New Zealand from
Or
English
from part of your
and
contract,
New Zealand
then
already.
if you really love the work and you want to
Some like
do
racist
more work, that's
cartoons and
40
stuff
hours a week,
going on
that's
back then.
fantastic for your apology, but we won't pay
It's
you.
pretty bad.
So it was like one of like some weird alien thing.
In
that
fact,
was
do we still have
like-
little like stick figure kind of thing? I thought that was weird. It's really unprofessional.
My mum is a
It's quite fun. Like
dyslexia
they're trying
management
to
consultant, so she
increase
loves
the
it.
level of actually
I showed
created
it to
it
Mac and he
in
was
order to
like,
make it seem
love
more
this.
believable.
I
It's
thought-
just someone
I was
that
like,
someone that looks
yeah,
like
I was
anyone
trying to
else,
pull
that
that.
doesn't
I
really
was like,
strike
trying to pull
fear,
this.
but then they exaggerate
That's
all
the
the
cover.
No, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's the
Wow,
image I
that's
was thinking of. Yeah.
sending
And it has,
signals
like,
or trying to send signals
Classic
that you're
My
really
flat
racist
described it as
caricature
a
of a Chinese man.
whitewashing.
Yeah.
Is it a greenwashing?
Octopus?
Yeah, like,
It's a big fake.
yeah.
They're still corporate.
Yeah.
I need to get this card back upstairs. It's
It's
already I would not, I could use a hand to carry some of these open biscuit packets back to office.
Do you think
Of
they'll
this
make
will be,
Do you really think they'll make it back?
You guys
If
should
they
get
would.
some.
And perhaps if you could try again.
Yeah. Last night he said he was consulting
Yeah, just in the
with
fridge,
engineers
yeah.
and
Now
he was
we'll be
like,
back up.
it's like,
Yeah.
because I actually,
Everyone should just go in to eat.
Alright, see you guys later. See you later. Bye. Good presentation.
I really want to move into the more data science programming direction, but I think study isn't what I need right now. I think I should just work and then see where
Earn
I'm
some
at.
money and get out in Fort Hills. You love the bike riding,
Yeah.
and see, get yourself a time limit, see where it takes
Yeah,
you.
and I should be able to take a winter off before these gigs, and I think that'll be nice with something lined up at the end of it.
That would be
'cause
good.
Time off with
You just go
on the job
skiing.
hunt would be a bit awful, I think,
Yeah.
psychologically, but just knowing there's something.
So wait, when would you start?
I suggested October as a start date,
That would
which
be
would give
nice.
me 4 months to,
Skiing,
Yeah.
riding and things like that.
yeah, and just sort of figuring out, I don't know, I feel like I used to like write and make art and like do a lot of
Yeah.
things, and I feel like engineering kind of sucked that out of me. Like I used to fill up a sketchbook every 4 months, and my latest sketchbooks only have engineering notes.
Right.
Like the
So
last
that tells
3
you
of them,
something.
and I'm like, I feel like I've just like lost for myself to this degree.
It's still in there.
Yeah.
It just hasn't been allowed.
Yeah.
So you're gonna be really to focus on that. Be
Yeah.
in your best place when you start.
And the masters has been a really good experience. It's given me a lot more confidence in myself, and I felt like so down on myself at the end of undergrad.
Really?
And I felt getting first class honours it like made me feel smart, and it didn't help at all.
Right, I
It's
thought you
just
would have
like,
felt so
yeah.
good and what you achieved by the end of it.
I just felt beaten up by it. And I felt like a fake. I felt like I just fudged my way through every assignment.
Really?
Whereas my masters, I'm like, this is my project, this is my work. It was a bloody miracle I made it happen, and I did it. And even though I don't know how well it will be, but I just was like in a really different headspace.
I'm so glad you did it then.
And I think also I'd like to go out on my own someday. So I guess it was that sort of check of like, do I have what it takes to be self-employed? Can I work without oversight or deadlines?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a yes.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
gonna be a crunchy thesis, but
That's okay.
Yeah.
It's more than crunchy. That's what there was definitely stuff I didn't understand, so it's way more than crunchy. Well, I'm really glad you did that then, because I mean,
yeah, I was.
unfortunately, you can't tell someone how to do it. They have to figure it out themselves. I'm glad you
Yeah.
figured that out.
Yeah, I think job interviewing always gives me a boost. Like I was really scared of looking a job just because of the like so many places just weren't even taking mechanical engineers, and then I got like pretty much instant offers the first 2 places I interviewed, and I was like, okay, people do want to hire me.
Yes, you need to
Yeah.
write that down.
Yeah.
Stamp that on yourself somewhere. Believe.
Yeah. So
Definitely believe. They'd be lucky to have you, Cassie.
yeah, but no, the university thing's been fun. Postgraduate's really different.
Good. Like, in what way?
I guess undergrad just felt like I was getting, when you're like wave jumping in the ocean and you're just getting slammed by wave after wave after wave, and
Yep.
you never catch your breath. That's what undergrad felt like, and I felt like I could never follow my interests because it'd be something I'd be passionate about, but I'd be like, there's no time in a week to go down a rabbit hole. Whereas postgrad's like your time is your own. The only thing you're accountable to is your thesis.
Yeah. And then you can actually learn the thing as
Yeah.
deeply as or as broadly as you want to.
Yeah, and then starting up the sustainable design club's been something I really wanted to do because I
Mhm.
wish that it existed while I'd been in undergrad.
Yeah.
I think I would have been so much more encouraged if I'd known there was a way to use these skills to do to
And
make
your
the world
passion.
better.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's
Surely
what I
that's growing.
Yeah, we had like 50 people come to our event on Wednesday.
Fantastic.
So that was great,
Yeah.
and I think we've got some really cool people. Like it's so much work
Yeah.
just to do like the tiniest thing because everyone's just so busy because we're all engineering students and
Yeah.
everyone's just like at
And it's
capacity all the time. But it's happening.
It's exhaustive just watching all of you. I'm going to ask you a question on that note. My son from Oregon asked me, he used to be in charge of the grad program, person at UC, not necessarily in mechanical, for someone, the sustainability person from like high up in Oracle to talk to at the university. Who's the sustainability person here? And I was like, I don't know, in mechanical, but
In terms of the university, it's
like sustainable engineering, I mean.
sustainable
I'm writing myself in it. Like, isn't there a new sustainable engineering something minor now? Is that civil though?
Not that I'm really aware of.
Oh,
There's a
environmental?
sustainability course. Yes, you can do it like just sustainability studies, but I believe that's through social sciences, not through engineering.
Right. Environmental engineering?
There's
Maybe was what I
natural
was
resource
thinking.
engineering, but that's not really.
I thought that was using natural
sustainability.
resources.
It is.
Scraping
Yeah.
natural resources. Do you know of like who a professor would be that is have anything to do with that kind of thing in engineering?
Honestly, there's nobody in mechanical.
Yeah, I don't think there is.
I'd say Jeff Pond's would be the closest we've got in mechanical, but it's not really.
He's not like
he's more into.
active enough.
Yeah. We really need to find someone for the club as well, so I'll ask around.
But do you not have any sort of staff person who's like your mentor or
We
something?
had Bill Moss was
Oh,
our,
yeah.
but yeah, we lost
He
Bill
left.
unfortunately. Because Bill was fantastic.
Was he? Oh,
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah, I would have a clue. And it should be an easy question, shouldn't it?
Because I think it's, because just lost her name. There's the vice chancellor of sustainability, who was, I think she was 2IC.
Oh. What's her name? Who used to be the vice chancellor here. She was the head of engineering.
Yeah.
Oh my god, how did I forget her name?
I'll send it
And you're right,
to you.
she does have that role.
Yeah, because we reached out to her and she's done a bunch of stuff in terms of the.
God, what's her name? I forget her name. You might say this, but it's not Liz.
Janet Evans Freeman. Yeah, so in terms of the wider university
Yeah.
sustainability strategy should be the contact. But
Okay, cool. There
Yes.
should be someone in engineering.
there isn't someone. I think there's people in civil who do adjacent stuff. There's like sort of renewable energy.
Yeah, I
there's
thought we could do
people who
things like that.
the like architecture course where you're sort of getting into
Yeah.
sustainable buildings, but there isn't really
Okay.
anyone. And then
Good to know.
there's also a humanitarian diploma, but it's more of a
Yeah, that's a whole different ballgame then.
resilience focus and sustainability, I guess.
I should go back to my office and finish stuff. Oh, actually, I need to leave. I have to get that done around time. Good luck with your decision making. And definitely good luck with wrapping things up and finishing your writing. Oh, and I'm curious too, were you able to see, just in a very general, without any numbers way, how the peas grew that had the
Yeah, we
drip and how the
actually
peas grew that didn't?
So I didn't really make it into the presentation, but we had some mistakes with what went in the ground versus what we thought was in the ground. So
Yeah.
the pressure of the spray plots wasn't what I thought it was.
Right.
So I actually applied about 25% more water to the spray plots than the drip plots.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but the soil moisture was very similar and the yield was very similar between them.
Okay.
So it's not a great comparative experiment from a scientific basis, but that's still an interesting result. And then there were visual differences in the plants.
So what was that? And that was you talking about the leaf size and that kind of thing?
There weren't differences from any of my sampling I did, which is really frustrating because
Yeah.
it was like 6 weeks of labour
Yeah.
getting that data, and then probably another 6 weeks of analysing it.
Peas might just grow too easily. You might need
Peas
something
are
that's
prone
pickier.
to water stress, but I think I did just slightly over irrigate, and I think my samples were just too small.
Right.
Because usually for an agricultural project like that, you'd have a whole team doing the sampling,
Right.
not just one
You can't do
student.
that by yourself.
Yeah, and so I think we really just needed more budget. It was really frustrating because it was so all these people had come together to make it happen, and it still wasn't quite enough to make it happen.
Right.
But then because all these people were putting in all this time, I had to be lovely and gracious and
Right.
charming the whole time,
Right.
and then but it still wasn't enough to sort of get the project working, and so I spent all the time in Paul's office just being like, this is shit, everything's shit, but
But it
and
wasn't.
people were amazing. Like so far, the Research Institute had no budget for this project, and people would come out after work to help
And
them
go and
because their
help.
boss had told them they weren't allowed to do anything on the clock.
Right. But everybody
So-
gets it, everybody wants to help, and
Yeah.
everybody understood the work, like looking at it from over here when I had nothing to do with it, I was like,
Yeah.
that's how that stuff goes. You
Yeah.
know, it wasn't shit at all.
Yeah.
And we would have learned so much stuff and attempted so much stuff and just so much learning would have